Now, the rest of the story. He was a bum. He was only a vagrant, so inobtrusive at first that folks struggled to recall when he had first begun hanging around the old train station. And he might have gone entirely unnoticed had it not been for a quirk, an eccentricity of his, an apparent penchant for meeting and greeting every train that stopped at Fort Benton. Railroad personnel mostly ignored him at first, attempting to discourage what they believed was a common panhandler, and yet he asked for nothing. Not once did he beg a handout from conductors or passengers. He just met the trains. And then somebody remembered that it was August of 36 when the vagrant had first showed up, and one by one the pieces began to fall into place, creating a mosaic, a total picture of the nobody who became somebody to people all over the world. And this is the rest of the story. The train depot at Fort Benton, Montana, was a lonely oasis, clinging to bluffs that embraced a nearby valley. Through a cluster of cottonwoods, you could look down on the town from there, or out to the blue mountains on the horizon line that jutted from the prairie floor high into the sky. You'd never imagine that a solitary tramp could haunt that train station and be remembered for it, and yet beginning in the summer of 1936, there was an aging eccentric who camped out nearby, who made it his business to greet each and every train that stopped at Fort Benton. On the days when he looked so bedraggled and hungry, the railroad employees would offer him food. On winter nights that seemed too terribly cold, the station master would shelter him in the station house, but otherwise the old vagrant accepted no charity for days and months, and then for years. Stories about him spread statewide, nationwide, worldwide, told by railroad passengers at first, then by newspapers describing his remarkable ritual. Letters poured into the Fort Benton depot from all over the United States and Canada and from abroad, expressing heartfelt good wishes to the stranger whom strangers thought of as a friend. And then one cold January day in 1942, this would be 5.5 years after he first showed up, the vagrant, according to onlookers, slipped on a railroad rail and fell into the path of a speeding train and was killed. They buried him on top of the bluff that looked down on the depot. Services were attended by the mayors of Fort Benton and neighboring Great Falls, and as countless admirers mourned, many of them wondered had the old vagrant sensed the futility of his earthly mission and at last sought to complete that mission elsewhere. Had he taken his own life? For you see, when he had first arrived at the Fort Benton station, it had been to accompany the body of his oldest and dearest friend, as it was brought in its coffin to the train to be transported back east for burial. Now, the man in the casket had been a sheep herder, but somehow the friend who saw him to the train failed to comprehend the forever goodbye, and so for the next 5.5 years, he lived in a hole he had dug for himself beneath the station house, and he met each and every train that stopped there, hoping that one day he and his sheepherder friend would meet again. January 12, 1942, they did. For thus in death were reunited the shepherd master and his fellow sheepherder, his ultimately faithful collie mongrel dog. And now you know the rest of the story.